In the salt-stained harbor of Newport Bay, where millionaires' yachts gleam beside weathered fishing boats, a desperate father was about to prove that sometimes the best solutions come from the most unexpected places. Jonas Carter had calloused hands and an empty bank account, but 30 years of naval engineering had taught him to see what others missed. When shipping heiress Celeste Beaumont's revolutionary yacht stumped every elite engineer on the West Coast, she threw down a challenge that would change everything. Her wave-powered catamaran sat broken in the harbor, bleeding millions in failed contracts, while her company's eco-cruise future hung in the balance. What nobody knew was that Joe had already solved the puzzle while helping his 10-year-old daughter Ellie with a science project involving a ukulele and a kiddie pool. But would a widowed dockhand really dare to challenge a woman who could buy and sell his entire neighborhood? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Newport Bay marina as Jonas Carter's weathered hands wrapped around his first cup of coffee. The ceramic mug chipped at the rim and bearing the faded logo of the USS Yorktown had been his companion for 15 years, ever since he'd traded his naval uniform for dock workers' coveralls. Steam rose from the dark brew, mingling with the salt air that carried the eternal symphony of creaking hulls and clanging rigging. Joe's small apartment sat above Chen's marine supply, a modest space that had become home after Sarah's medical bills consumed their savings and forced the sale of their house. The walls were thin enough that he could hear Mrs. Chen arranging inventory below, her methodical movements as predictable as the tides. Through the single window facing the harbor, he watched the morning ritual unfold. Yacht owners arriving in luxury sedans, while commercial fishermen finished securing their night's catch. The contrast never failed to strike him. On the east side of the harbor, gleaming mega yachts stretched like floating palaces, their chrome fixtures catching the sunlight, while uniformed crews performed morning maintenance. These vessels, some worth more than most people's lifetime earnings, represented a world Joe had glimpsed during his naval career, but never truly inhabited. On the west side, where he worked, rust-streaked trawlers and aging sport fishing boats told different storious tales of honest work, second mortgages, and the endless battle between man and sea. "Dad, you're burning the eggs again." Ellie's voice carried the patient exasperation of a child who'd inherited her mother's practical wisdom along with her father's scientific curiosity. At 10 years old, Eleanor Sarah Carter possessed an uncanny ability to observe the world with both wonder and precision, asking questions that often left adults scrambling for answers. Joe turned from the window to find his daughter already dressed for school, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that revealed Sarah's delicate features. She wore a hand-me-down sweater that Mrs. Chen's granddaughter had outgrown, but carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that worth wasn't measured in clothing labels. "Morning, kiddo." Joe rescued the eggs from the ancient stovetop, dividing them between two mismatched plates. "Sleep well?" "I dreamed about bioluminescent plankton again." Ellie settled into her chair, automatically reaching for the marine biology textbook that had become her constant companion. "Did you know that some species can produce light through chemical reactions that are more efficient than any man-made bulb?" Joe smiled, remembering Sarah's similar fascination with the ocean's mysteries. His late wife had been a marine engineer, drawn to the sea's hidden mechanics the way others were drawn to art or music. After her death 3 years ago, Joe had worried that Ellie might lose that spark of intellectual curiosity, but if anything, it had burned brighter. "Tell me more while we eat." He settled across from her, noting the way she brightened at his interest. These morning conversations had become sacred time, moments when the weight of unpaid bills and uncertain futures couldn't intrude on the pure joy of discovery. "Well, the light production is called bioluminescence, and it happens when luciferin, that's the light-producing molecule, reacts with luciferase, which is like the enzyme that makes it work." Ellie paused to take a bite of eggs, her mind clearly racing ahead to the next fascinating detail. But here's the really cool part: different species produce different colors depending on their chemical composition. Some make blue light, others make green, and a few can even make red. Sounds like nature's own light show. Joe reached across the table to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture that had become automatic since Sarah's death. Your mom would have loved hearing about this. I know. That's why I want to study oceanography when I grow up. I want to understand everything she loved about the ocean. Ellie's voice carried the matter-of-fact determination that reminded Joe so much of Sarah. Mrs. Patterson says I'll need to go to a really good college for marine science. She gave me a list of schools that have the best programs. Joe's chest tightened. He'd seen that list, tucked carefully between the pages of Ellie's textbook. Schools like Scripps Institution of Oceanography and Woods Hole institutions that represented excellence and opportunity, but also tuition costs that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all their relevance to his bank account. We'll figure it out, sweetheart. You're smart enough to earn scholarships, and by the time you're ready for college, things will be different. The words came easily, but Joe wondered if he was making promises he couldn't keep. Still, looking at his daughter's eager face, he couldn't bring himself to dim her dreams with talk of financial reality. After breakfast, they walked the familiar path to Ellie's school, passing the marina where Joe would spend another day coaxing life from aging engines and patching hulls that had seen better decades. The work was honest and necessary, but it barely covered their basic expenses. The overdue rent notice from Mrs. Chen sat folded in his wallet, a constant reminder that good intentions didn't pay bills. See you tonight, Dad. Ellie hugged him goodbye, her small arms fierce around his waist. Don't forget we're working on my wave energy project after dinner. Wouldn't miss it. Joe watched her join the stream of children entering the school, her backpack bouncing with each step. That projector demonstration of how wave motion could be converted to electrical energy had consumed their evenings for the past week. Ellie's enthusiasm was infectious, and Joe found himself looking forward to these sessions almost as much as she did. The walk back to the marina took him past the harbor's invisible dividing line, where polished brass gave way to galvanized steel and the scent of expensive cologne was replaced by the honest smell of diesel fuel and fish. This was Joe's world, practical, unpretentious, and populated by people who understood that every day was a negotiation between hope and necessity. His first stop was the Wanderer, a 30-foot sport fishing boat whose owner, Captain Martinez, had been battling a persistent fuel system problem for weeks. The boat sat low in the water, her hull scarred by countless encounters with dock pilings and rough seas, but her engine still purred when properly maintained. Morning, Joe. Captain Martinez emerged from the cabin, his weathered face creased with worry. She's acting up again. Started fine yesterday, but this morning she's coughing like an old man climbing stairs. Joe nodded, already reaching for his toolkit. The battered metal box had belonged to his father, a merchant marine who'd taught Joe that every problem had a solution if you were patient enough to find it. Inside, organized with military precision, were the tools of his trade knot, the gleaming instruments preferred by yacht mechanics but reliable companions that had served him well. Let's take a listen. Joe climbed aboard, immediately noting the subtle changes in the boat's sounds and movements. To an untrained ear, the engine might sound roughly normal, but Joe heard the telltale hesitation that suggested fuel delivery issues. When did you last replace the fuel filter? 3 months ago, maybe 4. Captain Martinez rubbed his stubbled chin, calculating. You think that's the problem? Part of it. Joe knelt beside the engine compartment, his hands automatically checking connections and listening for irregularities. But there's something else. It sounds like you've got water in the fuel line, probably condensation from the temperature changes we've been having. The diagnosis took 20 minutes, the repair another hour. Joe worked methodically, explaining each step to Captain Martinez, who listened with the attention of a man whose livelihood depended on understanding his equipment. This was what Joe loved about his work, the satisfaction of solving puzzles, the gratitude of people who needed his skills, the honest exchange of service for payment. "What do I owe you?" Captain Martinez asked as the engine settled into its proper rhythm. 40 for the filter, 20 for the labor. Joe closed his toolkit, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen countless similar cleanings. "And maybe keep that fuel tank topped off when you're not using her. Less airspace means less condensation." As Captain Martinez counted out the bills, Joe felt the familiar mixture of pride and frustration. He'd solved another problem, helped another person, but the payment barely covered his morning's expenses. At this rate, he'd need to work 18 hours a day just to break even, and that still wouldn't address the larger question of Ellie's future. The morning continued, with similar jobs: a clogged cooling system on a weekend sailor's sloop, a transmission adjustment on a harbor tour boat, the endless small repairs that kept the working side of the marina functioning. Each task reinforced Joe's reputation as the man who could fix anything, but reputation didn't pay for college tuition or reduce the stack of medical bills that still arrived months after Sarah's death. By lunch, Joe had worked his way down to the marina's far end, where the larger vessels moored. Here, the boats grew progressively more impressive, sleek cruisers with names like Tax Shelter and Liquid Assets, their owners visible mainly through the uniformed crews who maintained them. Joe rarely worked on these vessels. Their owners preferred certified yacht mechanics with impressive credentials and matching price tags. He was eating a sandwich beside the fuel dock when Mrs. Chen approached, her expression carefully neutral. At 68, she possessed the quiet authority of someone who'd built a successful business through decades of fair dealing and practical wisdom. Her family had owned the marina for 3 generations, and she understood both the rhythm of the harbor and the financial pressures that kept good people awake at night. "Joe, we need to talk." She settled beside him on the dock, her movements deliberate and careful. "I know things have been tight since Sarah's medical bills, and I've been patient because you're good people. But the marina's expenses don't stop, and I've got my own bills to pay." Joe nodded, having expected this conversation for weeks. "I know, Mrs. Chen. I'm behind on rent, and I appreciate you not pushing earlier. Is there any way I can work it off? Extra maintenance, weekend coverage, whatever you need. You already do more than I pay you for." Mrs. Chen's tone was gentle but firm. "The problem isn't your work ethic, Joe. It's simple mathematics. You owe 3 months' rent, and at your current income, you'll never catch up. I need a solution, not good intentions." The weight of her words settled over Joe like a familiar burden. He'd known this day would come, had even prepared for it, in the abstract way people prepare for inevitable disappointments. But sitting here in the sunshine, surrounded by the sounds and smells of the life he'd built, the reality felt heavier than he'd expected. "How long do I have?" he asked. "End of the month. That gives you 2 weeks to either catch up on the rent or find somewhere else to live." Mrs. Chen stood, her decision clearly difficult but final. "I'm sorry, Joe, if there was another way." "I understand." Joe forced a smile, not wanting to burden her with his problems. "You've been more than fair. I'll figure something out." As Mrs. Chen walked away, Joe stared across the harbor toward the expensive yachts, their chrome and glass surfaces reflecting the afternoon sun like mirrors. Somewhere, in that floating display of wealth, lay opportunities he'd never been able to access, problems that paid more than his monthly salary for a few hours' work. But those opportunities remained as distant as the horizon, separated from him by invisible barriers of class and expectation. The afternoon brought no relief from his financial worries, only the steady progression of small jobs that kept him busy but barely solvent. By 5 o'clock, when he finally locked his toolkit and headed home, Joe felt the familiar weight of uncertainty pressing against his chest. In a few hours, Ellie would be waiting for him, eager to continue their wave energy project, full of questions about the ocean's mysteries and dreams of her scientific future. How could he tell her that her future might be decided not by her brilliant mind or boundless curiosity, but by the simple arithmetic of their impossible situation? How could he explain that sometimes, no matter how hard you worked or how much you loved someone, the world's machinery ground forward with mechanical indifference to individual dreams? The answer, Joe realized as he climbed the stairs to their apartment, was that he couldn't. Not yet. Not until he'd exhausted every possibility, explored every option, and fought every battle that might give his daughter the chance she deserved. Somewhere in Newport Bay, he told himself, there had to be a solution. There had to be hope. He just hadn't found it yet. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made Newport Bay look like a postcard, all gleaming water and pristine sky. Joe was adjusting the carburetor on a vintage Chris Craft when the sound reached him, the deep, expensive rumble of multiple diesel engines fighting against each other in mechanical discord. He looked up from his work to see something he'd never witnessed in 15 years at the marina, a yacht being towed. But this wasn't just any yacht. The vessel limping toward the harbor was a study in contradiction, sleek and futuristic, yet clearly disabled, her twin hulls cutting through the water with the grace of a wounded bird. She was a catamaran, but unlike any Joe had seen before. Where traditional cats relied on wind or conventional engines, this one bristled with wave energy collectors along her hulls, sophisticated gyroscopic stabilizers, and what appeared to be an AI-controlled hydrofoil system. The tugboat captain guided the disabled yacht toward the premium berths, where a small crowd was already gathering. Word traveled fast in a marina, especially when the word involved expensive failure and frustrated owners. Joe found himself drawn toward the commotion, his engineer's curiosity overriding his usual preference for staying on the working side of the harbor. Careful with those lines. The voice that cut through the morning air carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. That stabilizer housing cost more than most people's cars. Joe's first glimpse of Celeste Beaumont confirmed everything the local gossips had whispered about the shipping heiress. She stood on the yacht's forward deck like a general surveying a lost battle, her perfectly tailored jacket and designer jeans somehow managing to look both practical and expensive. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that suggested efficiency rather than fashion, and her green eyes sparked with the kind of intelligent frustration that Joe recognized in people who were accustomed to solving problems through sheer force of will. Behind her, a small army of technicians and assistants scurried about with the nervous energy of people whose jobs depended on fixing the unfixable. Joe counted at least 6 men in matching polo shirts, each carrying tablets and instruments that probably cost more than his monthly salary. Their collective expertise represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in consulting fees, yet here they were, towing their patient home like a wounded animal. "Miss Beaumont, the preliminary diagnostics suggest," one of the technicians, a nervous man with expensive glasses, approached with a tablet displaying incomprehensible charts and graphs. "The diagnostics suggest exactly what the previous 29 diagnostics suggested." Celeste interrupted, her voice carrying the edge of someone who'd heard too many explanations for the same inexplicable failure. "The wave energy conversion system works perfectly in theory. The gyroscopic stabilizers are state-of-the-art, and the AI navigation system cost more than a small island. Yet somehow, when you put them all together, my revolutionary yacht handles like a drunk elephant on roller skates." Joe found himself smiling despite the woman's obvious frustration. There was something refreshing about her directness, even if it was wrapped in the kind of casual wealth that could buy and sell his entire neighborhood. He'd worked with enough engineers over the years to recognize the symptoms of overthinking when brilliant people became so focused on individual components that they lost sight of how systems interacted. "The harmonic resonance between the wave collectors and the stabilization system is creating," another technician began. "I know what it's creating," Celeste snapped. "It's creating a $200 million paperweight and threatening to sink my company's eco-cruise contracts. What I need is someone who can tell me how to fix it, not someone who can explain why it's broken." The group fell silent, their collective expertise suddenly seeming inadequate in the face of their employer's mounting frustration. Joe had seen this dynamic before the moment when theoretical knowledge met practical reality and discovered the gap between them. It was a gap that usually required a different kind of thinking, the kind that came from years of making imperfect systems work in imperfect conditions. 30 engineers, Celeste continued, her voice rising enough to carry across the water to where Joe stood listening. 30 of the most expensive marine engineers on the West Coast, and not one of them can make this thing work properly. Stanford graduates, MIT PhDs, consultants who charge more per hour than most people make in a week, and they're all stumped by a boat that should revolutionize clean ocean transport. She turned to face the small crowd that had gathered on the dock, her frustration finally boiling over into the kind of public display that made witnesses uncomfortable. You want to know what the problem is? The problem is that everyone thinks they're so smart they can reinvent the ocean. Well, guess what? The ocean doesn't care about your degrees or your consulting fees or your brilliant theories. The ocean just is, and if you can't work with it, it will break your expensive toys and send you home crying. Joe found himself nodding in agreement, remembering similar conversations with Sarah about the arrogance of engineers who tried to impose their will on natural systems instead of learning to work with them. The ocean had its own rhythms and rules, patterns that had been established over millions of years. Fighting those patterns was like trying to argue with gravity. You might win a few battles, but the war was already lost. So here's my challenge, Celeste announced, her voice carrying across the marina with the authority of someone making a public declaration. I'll pay anyone who can fix this boat $100,000. Cash. No questions asked. I don't care if you have a PhD from Harvard or barely finished high school. I don't care if you're the most expensive consultant in California or the guy who pumps gas at the corner station. If you can make this yacht work the way it's supposed to work, the money is yours. The offer sent a ripple of murmurs through the gathered crowd. $100,000 was serious money to anyone, but to the people who worked the docks, it represented something close to life-changing. Joe felt his heart rate quicken as he calculated what that kind of money could mean. Ellie's college fund, their overdue rent, a real chance at financial stability for the first time since Sarah's death. But here's the catch, Celeste continued, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. You get one chance. One. If you think you can fix it and you fail, you're banned from trying again. I'm tired of wasting time on people who think they're smarter than they actually are. She gestured toward the yacht, its sophisticated systems gleaming in the morning sun like a technological puzzle waiting to be solved. So if you're so smart, then fix my boat. Put your money where your mouth is and show me what you can do. But don't waste my time with theories and explanations and excuses. I've heard enough of those to last 3 lifetimes. The challenge hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet, its implications rippling through the crowd in waves of whispered conversations and nervous glances. Joe found himself studying the yacht with new interest, his engineer's eye automatically cataloguing the visible systems and trying to understand how they might interact. The wave energy collectors were elegant in their simplicity, designed to capture the motion of swells and convert it to electrical power. The gyroscopic stabilizers were more complex, using spinning masses to counteract the yacht's roll and pitch. The AI system was the wild card sophisticated enough to adjust the hydrofoils in real time based on sea conditions. Individually, each system represented cutting-edge technology, but Joe's experience had taught him that elegance in isolation often became chaos in combination. The more sophisticated the individual components, the more opportunities for unexpected interactions and harmonic conflicts. It was like trying to conduct an orchestra where each musician was playing a different piece of music, technically perfect, but utterly incompatible. "Dad?" Ellie's voice came from behind him, and Joe turned to find his daughter approaching with her school backpack and an expression of barely contained excitement. "Is that the yacht everyone's talking about? The one with the wave power system?" "Should be in school, kiddo," Joe said automatically, though he was secretly pleased to have her perspective on the problem. Ellie had a way of seeing things that adults missed, asking questions that cut through complexity to reach fundamental truths. "Teacher workday," Ellie explained, her attention already focused on the yacht. "Dad, look at the way those wave collectors are mounted." They're fighting against the stabilizers, aren't they? Like when I tried to tune my ukulele while the washing machine was running, the vibrations kept interfering with each other. Joe felt something click in his mind, a connection forming between his daughter's simple observation and the complex problem floating before them. The ukulele project, their ongoing investigation of wave energy and harmonic resonance, had taught them both about the delicate balance between competing forces. What if the yacht's problems weren't caused by any single system failure, but by the interaction between systems that were each working exactly as designed? "Tell me more about that," he said quietly, his attention suddenly focused entirely on his daughter's insight. "Well, remember how we figured out that the waves in my kiddie pool move differently when I changed the frequency of the vibration? And how the ukulele strings would resonate with certain frequencies but fight against others?" Ellie's excitement was growing as she worked through the problem. What if that yacht's wave collectors are creating resonance patterns that the stabilizers are trying to cancel out? They'd be fighting each other instead of working together. The simplicity of the insight was breathtaking. Joe looked at the yacht with new understanding, seeing not a collection of sophisticated systems, but a single organism whose parts were at war with each other. The wave collectors were designed to capture and convert ocean motion, while the stabilizers were designed to eliminate motion. The AI system was trying to optimize both functions simultaneously, creating a feedback loop that guaranteed failure. "That's brilliant, sweetheart," Joe said, his mind already racing ahead to potential solutions. "Absolutely brilliant." "Are you going to try to fix it?" Ellie asked, her voice mixing excitement with concern. $100,000 would pay for a lot of college." Joe looked at his daughter, then at the yacht, then at Celeste Beaumont, who was still holding court with her frustrated technicians. The distance between his world and hers seemed vast, not just social or economic, but philosophical. Her approach to problems involved throwing money and expertise at them until they submitted. His approach involved patience, observation, and the kind of practical wisdom that came from years of making imperfect things work in imperfect conditions. But Ellie was right about the money. $100,000 would change everything for them. It would pay off their debts, secure Ellie's education, and give them the financial breathing room that had been missing since Sarah's death. More than that, it would prove that his skills, real skills, not just his ability to patch and maintain, had value in a world that seemed to prize credentials over competence. The question wasn't whether he could fix the yacht. Looking at it now, understanding the fundamental flaw in its design, Joe was confident he could solve the problem that had stumped 30 expensive engineers. The question was whether he had the courage to step across that invisible line between his world and theirs, to risk public failure for the chance of spectacular success. "If you're so smart, then fix my boat," Celeste had said. The challenge echoed in Joe's mind as he watched her dismiss another technician's explanation with an impatient gesture. She was looking for someone who could see what others had missed, someone who could solve problems instead of analyzing them to death. Joe took a deep breath, tasting salt air and possibility in equal measure. Then he stepped forward, Ellie beside him, and walked toward the most important conversation of his life. "Excuse me, Miss Beaumont." Joe's voice carried across the yacht's deck with the quiet confidence of someone who was used to being heard, even when he wasn't the loudest person in the room. Celeste turned toward him, her expression shifting from frustrated impatience to curious assessment as she took in his appearance-work clothes, calloused hands, and the unmistakable bearing of someone who solved problems for a living. "I'm Jonas Carter. I work here at the marina, and I think I might be able to help with your yacht." The technicians around Celeste exchanged glances that ranged from amusement to outright skepticism. One of them, a man whose polo shirt bore the logo of an expensive consulting firm, actually chuckled before catching himself. Joe felt the familiar sting of class dismissal, the automatic assumption that his lack of credentials meant lack of competence. "Mr. Carter," Celeste said, her tone carefully neutral, "I appreciate your interest, but this isn't exactly a carburetor problem. This yacht incorporates some of the most advanced marine technology ever developed. The wave energy conversion system alone represents 5 years of research and development. I understand that, Joe replied, gesturing toward Ellie, who stood beside him with her characteristic mixture of shyness and determination. But my daughter here just made an observation that I think you should hear. Ellie, tell Miss Beaumont what you noticed about the wave collectors and stabilizers. Ellie stepped forward, her voice clear despite the intimidating audience. They're fighting each other. The wave collectors are trying to capture ocean motion and turn it into energy, but the stabilizers are trying to eliminate motion to keep the boat steady. They're working against each other instead of together, like trying to play music while someone's covering your ears. The simplicity of the observation seemed to catch Celeste off guard. She looked from Ellie to Joe, then toward her yacht, her expression shifting as she processed the implications. That's actually quite insightful. But surely my engineers have considered harmonic interference between systems. Have they? Joe asked gently. Because from what I can see, each system was probably designed and tested independently. Wave collectors work great in isolation, stabilizers work great in isolation, AI navigation works great in isolation. But put them all together, and you've got 3 systems trying to optimize different parameters simultaneously. One of the technicians stepped forward, his skepticism evident. Mr. Carter, with all due respect, we've run comprehensive diagnostics on every system interaction. The computer models show perfect compatibility between... Computer models are only as good as their assumptions, Joe interrupted, not unkindly. And sometimes the real world doesn't follow the computer's rules. May I take a look at the actual systems? Celeste studied Joe for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face for something competence, confidence, or perhaps just honest intention. You understand my offer. One chance, Mr. Carter. If you think you can fix what 30 engineers couldn't, you get one opportunity to prove it. If you fail, you're done. I understand. Joe's voice carried the steady assurance of someone who had faced similar moments throughout his career, moments when theory met practice and only one survived. But I'd like to examine the systems first, understand how they actually behave rather than how they're supposed to behave. Fair enough. Celeste gestured toward the yacht. You have until sunset. If you want to try a fix, you can start tomorrow morning. But Mr. Carter, I hope you understand what you're risking. Public failure in front of half the marina isn't exactly a resume builder. Joe followed Celeste aboard the yacht, Ellie close beside him, both of them immediately struck by the vessel's sophisticated beauty. The deck was a study in functional elegance, every surface and component designed with the kind of attention to detail that came from unlimited budgets and uncompromising standards. But underneath the polish, Joe sensed the tension of a machine at war with itself. This is the primary control interface, Celeste explained, leading them to a console that looked more like something from a spacecraft than a boat. The AI system monitors sea conditions and adjusts the hydrofoils and stabilizers in real time. Wave height, frequency, wind speed, boat speed. It processes hundreds of variables every second. Joe nodded, his hands instinctively moving toward the controls before stopping himself. This wasn't his equipment, and he couldn't afford to break something while trying to understand it. And the wave collector show, do they integrate with the stabilization system? They don't, really. That's part of the elegance of the design. Each system operates independently, with the AI coordinating overall performance. Celeste's pride in the yacht's conception was evident, even through her frustration with its performance. The wave collectors capture energy from hull motion, the stabilizers minimize passenger discomfort, and the AI optimizes both functions for maximum efficiency. But what happens when those functions conflict? Ellie asked, her young voice cutting through the technical explanations with characteristic directness. What does the AI do when the wave collectors want the boat to move one way and the stabilizers want it to move another way? The question hung in the air like a challenge. And Joe saw something flicker in Celeste's expression, the recognition that a 10-year-old had identified a flaw that millions of dollars in engineering consultation had missed. The AI is supposed to balance those competing demands, she said slowly. find the optimal compromise between energy collection and stability. But what if there is no optimal compromise? Joe asked. What if the fundamental design requires the systems to fight each other, and the AI is just managing the conflict rather than resolving it? They spent the next 2 hours examining every aspect of the yacht's systems, Joe asking questions that seemed almost naive in their simplicity, while Ellie pointed out details that the adults had overlooked. The wave collectors were indeed elegant pieces of engineering, designed to flex and move with the ocean's rhythm while converting that motion into electrical energy. The stabilizers were equally sophisticated, using gyroscopic forces and active fin control to minimize the yacht's movement in response to waves and wind. The problem, Joe began to realize, wasn't in either system individually, it was in their fundamental incompatibility. The yacht was trying to be two different things simultaneously, a wave energy collector that worked best when moving with the ocean's rhythm, and a stable platform that worked best when isolated from that same rhythm. It's like trying to dance and stand perfectly still at the same time, Ellie observed as they examined the stabilizer housing. You can't do both well. Joe found himself thinking of Sarah, remembering late-night conversations about the ocean's patterns and the futility of fighting natural forces. She had always insisted that the best marine engineering worked with the sea rather than against it, finding harmony instead of imposing control. Looking at this yacht, he could almost hear her voice pointing out the arrogance of trying to master forces that had shaped the planet for millions of years. Ms. Beaumont, Joe said finally, straightening up from his examination of the wave collectors, I think I understand the problem, but the solution isn't going to be what your engineers expect. It's not about upgrading components or fine-tuning the AI. It's about fundamentally changing how these systems relate to each other. What do you mean? Celeste's attention was completely focused now, her earlier skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity. Joe pulled out his phone and showed her a video Ellie had recorded for her science projector, simple demonstration involving a ukulele floating in a kiddie pool, its strings resonating with the water's movement. Harmony, he said simply. Instead of fighting the ocean's motion, we need to find a way for all the systems to move together, like musicians playing the same song. That's impossible, one of the technicians protested. The stabilizers are specifically designed to counteract motion. You can't make them work with the wave collectors, they're fundamentally opposed functions. Are they? Joe asked, his mind already working through possibilities that seemed obvious now that he understood the real problem. Or are we just thinking about them wrong? What if instead of trying to eliminate motion, we taught the stabilizers to manage it? What if instead of fighting the wave collectors, they learned to dance with them? The idea was taking shape in his mind, built on principles he'd learned during his naval career and refined through years of making imperfect systems work in imperfect conditions. It wasn't about forcing the yacht's components to submit to human will, it was about helping them find their natural harmony with each other and with the ocean itself. I'll need tonight to think through the details, Joe said, looking at Celeste with the quiet confidence of someone who had found his element. But I believe I can fix your boat. Not by changing what it is, but by helping it become what it was always meant to be. As they prepared to leave the yacht, Celeste caught Joe's arm. Mr. Carter, why are you doing this? You could have a comfortable life just maintaining the boats you already work on. Why risk public failure for a problem that stumped experts with a lot more credentials than you have? Joe looked at Ellie, who was carefully recording observations in her science notebook, her face bright with the excitement of discovery. Because my daughter deserves a chance to follow her dreams, he said simply, and because sometimes the experts get so focused on being right that they forget to be useful. That evening, back in their small apartment above the marine supply store, Joe spread Sarah's old engineering notebooks across the kitchen table while Ellie worked on her homework nearby. The notebooks were filled with her careful observations about wave patterns, harmonic resonance, and the delicate balance between natural forces and human engineering. Reading her words, Joe felt her presence almost as strongly as if she was sitting beside him, guiding his thoughts towards solutions that honored, rather than fought the ocean's ancient wisdom. Dad? Ellie looked up from her math homework. Do you really think you can fix that yacht? I think we can fix it. Joe corrected gently. Your observation about harmonic conflict was the key to understanding the real problem. Now we just need to find a way to turn conflict into cooperation. As the night deepened and the harbor grew quiet around them, Joe worked through the technical details of his proposed solution, sketching modifications and calculating adjustments by the light of the table lamp. Outside their window, the yacht sat in her berth like a sleeping giant, waiting for tomorrow's test of whether practical wisdom could succeed where theoretical brilliance had failed. The solution, Joe realized, would require not just technical skill but a fundamental shift in thinking from domination to harmony, from control to cooperation, from fighting the ocean to dancing with it. It was exactly the kind of challenge that Sarah would have loved, and exactly the kind of opportunity that could change everything for him and Ellie. Tomorrow would determine whether a widowed dock worker could succeed where 30 engineers had failed, whether a 10-year-old's simple insight could unlock millions of dollars in stalled innovation, and whether the principles of harmony and cooperation could triumph over the arrogance of technological force. Joe closed Sarah's notebook and smiled. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. Dawn broke over Newport Bay with the kind of crystalline clarity that made even the most weathered dock worker pause to appreciate the morning's beauty. Joe had been awake since 4, his mind racing through calculations and possibilities while his hands went through the familiar ritual of making coffee and preparing for what might be the most important day of his life. Ellie emerged from her bedroom already dressed, her science notebook tucked under her arm and her eyes bright with excitement. Ready to fix a yacht, Dad? Ready to try, Joe corrected, though his confidence had grown overnight as he'd worked through the technical details of his solution. Sarah's notebooks had provided the theoretical foundation, but the practical implementation would require the kind of improvised engineering that had become his specialty over the years. They walked to the marina together, passing the early morning joggers and dog walkers who populated the harbor's quiet hours. The yacht looked different in the morning, lightless, like an expensive failure, and more like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Joe could see Celeste's team already gathering on the dock, their expensive equipment and matching polo shirts, a stark contrast to his battered toolkit and work clothes. "Mr. Carter," Celeste's voice carried across the water as she approached with her characteristic blend of authority and barely contained energy. "I hope you had a productive night. My investors are flying in this afternoon to see either a miraculous fix or a very expensive admission of defeat." "We had a very productive night," Joe replied, gesturing toward Ellie, who was already studying the yacht's wave collectors with renewed interest. "But before we start, I need to explain what we're going to do and why it's different from what your other engineers attempted." Celeste nodded, her attention focused completely on Joe's explanation. Around them, the technicians gathered with the careful neutrality of professionals who had seen too many miracle cures fail to get excited about another one. "The problem isn't mechanical," Joe began, pulling out a simplified diagram he'd sketched the night before. "Every component on your yacht works exactly as designed. The wave collectors capture energy efficiently, the stabilizers minimize motion effectively, and the AI processes information flawlessly. The problem is that they're all trying to accomplish contradictory goals." He pointed to different sections of his diagram as he explained. "The wave collectors work best when the yacht moves, with the ocean's rhythm rolling, pitching, and yawing in response to wave action. The stabilizers work best when they eliminate that same motion, keeping the yacht as steady as possible. The AI tries to optimize both functions simultaneously, which creates a feedback loop where the systems fight each other instead of working together." "But surely there's an optimal balance point," one of the technicians interjected. "Our computer models showed." "Your computer models assumed that optimal meant finding a compromise between competing functions," Ellie interrupted, her young voice carrying surprising authority. "But what if optimal means changing the functions so they don't compete anymore?" Joe smiled at his daughter's insight, remembering Sarah's belief that the most elegant solutions often came from changing the question rather than improving the answer. Exactly. Instead of trying to balance wave collection against stabilization, we're going to teach them to work together. Over the next hour, Joe explained his proposed solution, while his hands began the delicate work of implementing it. The modifications were surprisingly simple in concept, but required precise execution. Instead of trying to eliminate the yacht's motion, the stabilization system would be reprogrammed to manage and channel that motion in ways that enhanced, rather than fought, the wave collector's function. Think of it like surfing, Joe explained, as he adjusted the stabilizer controls. A surfer doesn't fight the wave, they find the wave's rhythm and use it to their advantage. We're teaching your yacht to surf the ocean's energy instead of fighting it. The work required both high-tech programming and old-fashioned mechanical adjustment. Joe's years of naval engineering had taught him to work with systems that needed to function reliably in conditions their designers had never imagined. Celeste's yacht was sophisticated, but the principles of harmonic resonance and mechanical sympathy were as old as the first sail. "This is remarkable," Celeste said as she watched Joe work. "You're not adding new components or upgrading existing systems, you're just changing how they talk to each other." "Harmony," Ellie added from her position near the wave collectors, where she was carefully monitoring their response to Joe's adjustments. "Like a band where everyone's playing the same song instead of different songs at the same time." The morning progressed with the careful intensity of a surgical operation. Joe worked methodically through each system, adjusting parameters and recalibrating responses while explaining his reasoning to Celeste and her increasingly interested team. What had seemed impossible yesterday, making competing systems cooperate, began to look not just possible but inevitable. "The key insight," Joe explained as he fine-tuned the AI's response patterns, "is that the ocean isn't your enemy. It's been moving energy around this planet for billions of years with perfect efficiency. Instead of trying to impose our will on that system, we need to learn from it and work with it." By noon, the modifications were complete. The yacht's systems had been reprogrammed to function as a single organism rather than competing components, each element supporting and enhancing the others instead of fighting for dominance. The wave collectors would capture energy from the yacht's motion, the stabilizers would manage that motion to optimize energy capture while maintaining passenger comfort, and the AI would coordinate the entire system to work in harmony with whatever conditions the ocean provided. "Ready for a test run?" Joe asked, wiping his hands on the towel that had become his constant companion throughout the morning's work. Celeste nodded, her expression mixing anticipation with the kind of nervous energy that came from betting everything on an untested solution. "My investors will be here in 2 hours. If this works, we'll have something miraculous to show them. If it doesn't, it'll work," Ellie said, with the absolute confidence that only children could muster. "Dad's fixes always work." The yacht's engines came to life with a smooth rumble that seemed somehow different from the previous day's mechanical discord. As they pulled away from the dock, Joe felt the familiar satisfaction of machinery working in harmony rather than conflict. The wave collectors began their subtle dance with the ocean's rhythm, while the stabilizers moved in sympathy rather than opposition. "This is extraordinary." Celeste breathed as the yacht settled into its stride. "The motion is completely different, smoother, more natural. It feels like the boat is part of the ocean instead of fighting it." Joe watched the various displays and gauges, noting how the different systems supported each other's function instead of competing for resources. The wave collectors captured energy from the yacht's motion, while the stabilizers channeled that motion to maximize both energy generation and passenger comfort. The AI coordinated everything with the fluid responsiveness of a natural system rather than the rigid logic of competing programs. Energy generation is up 30% from yesterday's tests. One of the technicians reported, his skepticism replaced by professional admiration. "And passenger comfort metrics are better than anything we achieved with the original stabilization protocols." They spent the next hour putting the yacht through increasingly challenging test-sharp turns, speed changes, and deliberate encounters with the day's moderate swells. Each test confirmed what Joe had hoped and Ellie had predicted. The yacht was no longer fighting itself or the ocean, but working in harmony with natural forces to achieve what pure technology had failed to accomplish. "How did you know this would work?" Celeste asked as they headed back toward the marina. 30 engineers with advanced degrees couldn't solve this problem, but you and your daughter figured it out in one night. Joe thought about Sarah's notebooks, about years of naval experience, about the countless small repairs that had taught him the difference between mechanical force and mechanical sympathy. "Experience," he said finally, "and the willingness to listen to what the ocean was trying to teach us instead of trying to impose our own ideas on it. Plus, Dad's really smart," Ellie added loyally. "He just doesn't have the fancy certificates to prove it." As they approached the marina, Joe could see a crowd gathering on the dock. Word of the test run had spread, and half the harbor seemed to be waiting to see whether the local mechanic had succeeded where the experts had failed. Among the crowd, Joe spotted several people in expensive suits who could only be Celeste's investors, their presence adding weight to the moment. "Whatever happens next," Celeste said quietly, "I want you to know that you've taught me something important today. About listening instead of demanding, about working with natural forces instead of trying to dominate them. That's worth more than the yacht repairs." Joe felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. For the first time since Sarah's death, his work felt like more than just survival. It felt like purpose. "Thank you," he said simply. "That means more than you know." As the yacht glided smoothly into her berth, the crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. Joe had done what 30 engineers couldn't, not through superior credentials or expensive equipment, but through the kind of practical wisdom that came from years of listening to what machines and ocean were trying to tell him. But even as he acknowledged the congratulations and handshakes, Joe understood that this was just the beginning. Celeste's investors would have questions, her company would have expectations, and the solution that worked in Newport Bay would need to prove itself in the wider world. The real test was just beginning. The celebration on the dock felt surreal to Joe, who had spent most of his adult life working in the shadows, while others took credit for his contributions. Now, suddenly, he found himself surrounded by people who wanted to shake his hand, ask technical questions, and understand how he'd accomplished what an army of consultants couldn't. "Mr. Carter, that was absolutely brilliant," said one of Celeste's investors, a distinguished man whose handshake carried the firm confidence of someone accustomed to making million-dollar decisions. "I've never seen anything like it. The yacht's performance metrics exceeded our most optimistic projections." Joe nodded politely, but his attention was drawn to Celeste, who stood slightly apart from the crowd with an expression he couldn't quite read. There was satisfaction there, certainly, and relief at the yacht's success. But underneath those emotions, he sensed something more complexer, mixture of gratitude and vulnerability that suggested this victory meant more to her than simple business success. "Dad, they're asking about the payment," Ellie whispered, tugging at his sleeve. "The $100,000. The money." In the excitement of solving the problem and proving his solution, Joe had almost forgotten about Celeste's original offer. $100,000 would change everything for them, eliminate their debts, secure Ellie's education, and provide the kind of financial stability that had seemed impossible just 24 hours ago. "Miss Beaumont," Joe approached her as the crowd began to disperse, "about your offer. You don't want the money." Celeste's statement wasn't a question, and Joe realized that his reluctance must have been visible in his expression. "Why not? You earned it." "More than earned it." Joe glanced at Ellie, who was watching the conversation with the intense focus she usually reserved for her science projects. "I want something smaller," he said finally, "just enough to cover Ellie's school deposit for next year. Maybe $5,000. The rest I'd rather you use it for something that matters." Celeste stared at him, as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "Mr. Carter, I offered you $100,000. You solved a problem that was costing my company millions. 5,000 is insulting." 5,000 changes our life," Joe replied quietly. 100,000 changes who we are. There's a difference. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a woman Joe hadn't seen before, tall, elegantly dressed, with the kind of commanding presence that suggested both wealth and authority. She approached Celeste with the familiarity of someone who had known her for years, but Joe noticed the subtle tension that entered Celeste's posture at her approach. "Celeste, darling, what a dramatic little demonstration." The woman's voice carried the cultured tones of old money and older expectations. "Though I have to say, hiring a local mechanic does seem rather desperate." "Mother." Celeste's tone was carefully neutral, but Joe caught the flash of irritation in her green eyes. "I didn't expect you to come personally. When my daughter's company faces potential bankruptcy, I make time." Margaret Beaumont's gaze swept over Joe with the kind of assessment that reduced people to their economic utility. "Mr. Carter, isn't it? Celeste tells me you've managed to make her little boat work properly. How refreshing to find competent help among the working class." Joe felt Ellie stiffen beside him, and he placed a protective hand on her shoulder. He'd encountered this kind of casual condescension throughout his career, the automatic assumption that blue-collar work meant blue-collar intelligence. Usually, he let it pass without comment, understanding that arguing with prejudice rarely changed minds. But something about Margaret Beaumont's tone, her obvious effect on Celeste, sparked a protective instinct he couldn't ignore. "Actually, Mrs. Beaumont, your daughter's yacht is a remarkable piece of engineering. The problem wasn't with the quality of the components, but with how they were integrated. Sometimes, an outside perspective can see solutions that familiarity obscures." How diplomatic. Margaret's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Celeste always did have a talent for finding exotic solutions to simple problems. "I suppose that's what happens when you give a young woman too much freedom and too much money." Joe watched Celeste's face during this exchange, noting the way her mother's words seemed to diminish her, even as she stood surrounded by evidence of her success. It was a dynamic he recognized from his own childhood, the way criticism from people who mattered could overshadow any amount of external validation. "The yacht represents a significant breakthrough in sustainable marine technology," Joe said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who understood what he was talking about. "The applications for commercial shipping and recreational boating are enormous. Your daughter should be proud of what she's accomplished." "Pride," Margaret said with the kind of laugh that managed to be both elegant and cruel, "is what led to this mess in the first place. Celeste has always been more interested in making statements than making money. Idealism is charming in children, but business requires pragmatism." "Sometimes idealism and pragmatism point in the same direction," Ellie said suddenly, her young voice cutting through the adult conversation with characteristic directness. "Making boats that work with the ocean instead of fighting it isn't just good for the environment, it's better engineering." Margaret's attention turned to Ellie with the kind of surprised interest that adults reserved for children who spoke above their supposed station. "And you are?" "Eleanor Carter. I helped my dad figure out the harmonic resonance problem." Ellie's chin lifted with quiet pride. "The ocean has been moving energy around for millions of years. It seemed silly to fight something that old and that smart." For a moment, Margaret seemed genuinely taken aback by Ellie's calm confidence. Then her expression shifted back to its default setting of polite dismissal. "How precocious." "Celeste, we need to discuss the implications of today's success. There are decisions to be made about scaling production, licensing agreements, patent protections." "Mother, please." Celeste's voice carried a weariness that suggested this conversation had been repeated many times before. "Can't we at least acknowledge what's been accomplished here before we start planning how to commercialize it?" "Acknowledgement doesn't pay stockholders, darling. Mr. Carter has solved your immediate problem, which is wonderful. But now we need to think strategically about how to protect and monetize his solution." Joe felt a chill run down his spine as Margaret's words sank in. He'd been so focused on solving the technical problem that he hadn't considered the broader implications of his success. In fixing Celeste's yacht, he'd created something valuable, potentially very valuable. And in a world where value meant ownership, his lack of legal protection might mean that his solution would benefit everyone except the person who'd created it. "Mr. Carter," Margaret continued, as if reading his thoughts, "I assume you'll be wanting some kind of ongoing arrangement. Consulting fees, perhaps, or a position with Celeste's company. I'm sure we can work out something suitable." The offer was presented with the kind of casual generosity that made it clear who held the power in the negotiation. Joe would be grateful for whatever scraps fell from their table, happy to have his expertise valued at whatever rate they deemed appropriate. It was the same dynamic he'd encountered throughout his career: recognition without respect, opportunity without equity. "I think," Joe said carefully, "that depends on what Miss Beaumont wants. It's her yacht, her company, and her decision." Celeste looked between her mother and Joe, her expression troubled. "Mr. Carter, you've done something remarkable here. Something that could revolutionize how we think about sustainable marine propulsion. That's worth more than a one-time payment or a consulting arrangement." "Celeste," Margaret's voice carried a warning, "don't let gratitude override business sense. Mr. Carter has provided a service, and he should be compensated appropriately for that service. But let's not confuse fixing a boat with founding a company." "What if it's not just about fixing a boat?" Celeste asked, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "What if it's about proving that a different approach to engineering problems can yield better results? What if Mr. Carter's solution isn't just a repair, but a completely new way of thinking about marine technology?" Joe found himself caught between admiration for Celeste's vision and concern about the expectations it created. He'd solved one problem on one yacht, significant achievement, certainly, but hardly the foundation for revolutionizing an entire industry. Yet as he looked at the yacht floating peacefully in her berth, her systems working in perfect harmony with each other and with the ocean itself, he couldn't deny that something important had happened here. "Ms. Beaumont," he said finally, "I appreciate your confidence in what we've accomplished. But before we start talking about revolutions and new approaches, maybe we should focus on making sure this solution actually works in the real world. One successful test doesn't prove anything except that the concept has potential." "Which is exactly why," Margaret interjected, "we need to move quickly to protect that potential. Patents, licensing agreements, non-disclosure, contracts, the usual mechanisms for ensuring that innovation benefits its proper owners." "And who," Ellie asked with the kind of innocent directness that made adults uncomfortable, "are the proper owners? The person who had the idea, the person who built the boat, or the person who figured out how to make it work?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, highlighting the complex relationship between innovation, ownership, and reward that lay at the heart of so many modern disputes. Joe had created something valuable, but he'd created it using Celeste's equipment to solve Celeste's problem on Celeste's yacht. The legal ownership might be clear, but the moral ownership was more complicated. "What I'd like," Celeste said slowly, as if working through the implications as she spoke, "is to test this solution more thoroughly. A real-world shakedown voyage, where we can see how the system performs under various conditions. Mr. Carter, would you be willing to join me for a 2-week cruise to put your modifications through their paces?" Joe looked at Ellie, whose eyes had gone wide with excitement at the prospect of an ocean adventure. 2 weeks away from the marina, away from their cramped apartment and constant financial worries, away from the familiar constraints of their everyday life. It was an opportunity for Ellie to see the world beyond Newport Bay, to experience the ocean she dreamed of studying from the deck of one of the most advanced yachts ever built. "We'd be honored," Joe said, speaking for both of them. "But I'd want to bring my tools, just in case any adjustments are needed during the voyage." "Of course," Celeste smiled, and Joe noticed how much younger she looked when her expression wasn't weighed down by corporate pressures and family expectations. "We'll provision for an extended cruise, maybe down to Catalina and back, with stops at some of the Channel Islands. It'll give us a chance to test the system under different conditions and see how it performs over time." Margaret's expression suggested that she viewed this plan as somewhere between reckless adventure and expensive vacation. Celeste, I hardly think a pleasure cruise is the most efficient way to validate a technical solution. Surely controlled testing would be more appropriate. Mother, we've done controlled testing for 3 years. What we need now is real-world experience. Mr. Carter's solution works because it's based on practical understanding of how systems behave in actual conditions. We need to honor that approach. As the afternoon wore on and the details of the voyage were discussed, Joe found himself caught between excitement and apprehension. The success of his yacht repair had opened doors he'd never imagined walking through, but it had also created expectations and obligations that made him uncomfortable. He was a simple dock worker who'd gotten lucky with one problem. Was he really qualified to represent a new approach to marine engineering? The answer, he realized as he watched Ellie chatting excitedly with Celeste about the planned voyage, didn't matter as much as the opportunity itself. Whether he succeeded or failed on a grander scale, he'd already given his daughter something precious, the knowledge that intelligence and creativity weren't limited by credentials or class, that good ideas could come from anywhere, and that sometimes the most profound solutions were also the most simple. As the sun set over Newport Bay, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson, Joe felt a mixture of gratitude and determination. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight, for the first time in years, the future felt full of possibility rather than limitations. The real voyage was about to begin. 3 days later, Joe stood on the yacht's deck, watching the California coastline recede into the morning haze. The departure from Newport Bay had been smooth and efficient, with Celeste's crew handling the yacht's systems with the kind of professional competence that came from years of experience. But it was Joe's modifications that made the journey feel different. The yacht moved through the water with a fluid grace that seemed almost alive, responding to the ocean's rhythm rather than fighting it. "Dad, look at this!" Ellie's voice carried across the deck from where she knelt beside one of the wave collectors, her notebook open as she recorded observations. The energy output keeps changing based on the wave patterns, but it's like the system is learning to predict what's coming next. Joe joined his daughter, noting the steady stream of data flowing across the yacht's monitoring systems. The wave collectors were indeed adapting to conditions in real time, their mechanical components working in harmony with the AI's predictive algorithms to maximize energy capture while maintaining passenger comfort. It was exactly what he'd hoped to achieve, but seeing it work so seamlessly in open ocean conditions filled him with a satisfaction that went beyond professional pride. "The beauty of it," Celeste said, approaching with 2 cups of coffee, "is that the system gets more efficient the longer it runs. It's learning the ocean's patterns and adjusting accordingly." She handed Joe one of the cups, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The contact was casual, innocent, but Joe felt an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. Over the past 3 days, he'd begun to see beyond Celeste's corporate exterior to the woman underneath, intelligent, passionate, and surprisingly vulnerable beneath her confident facade. "Your modifications have exceeded every projection," Celeste continued, settling beside him at the rail. "Energy generation is up 40% from our best previous performance, and the ride quality is smoother than anything we achieved with the original stabilization system." "It's working the way Sarah always said it should," Joe replied, his voice carrying the gentle melancholy that still accompanied thoughts of his late wife. She believed that the best engineering solutions were collaborations with natural forces rather than attempts to dominate them. "Tell me about her," Celeste said quietly, "about Sarah." Joe found himself opening up in ways that surprised him, sharing memories of his wife's brilliant insights and passionate commitment to sustainable marine technology. Sarah had been ahead of her time, advocating for approaches that seemed revolutionary then, but felt obviously correct now. Her notebooks had provided the theoretical foundation for Joe's practical solution, bridging the gap between academic understanding and real-world application. "She would have loved this yacht," Joe said, watching the wave collectors flex and respond to the ocean's movement. Not because of its luxury, but because of what it represents: technology that works with natural systems instead of trying to replace them. "I think I would have liked her," Celeste said, and Joe heard genuine warmth in her voice. "She sounds like someone who understood that innovation isn't about imposing your will on the world, but about finding better ways to work with what already exists." Their conversation was interrupted by Ellie's excited call from the stern. "Dad, Celeste, you need to see this." They hurried to where Ellie stood, pointing at the yacht's wake, her face bright with discovery. The water behind them showed the typical pattern of disturbed water that marked any vessel's passage, but there was something different about it. The wake seemed more organized, less chaotic than what Joe expected from a yacht of this size. "The hydrofoils are creating laminar flow patterns," Ellie explained, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who'd just witnessed something remarkable. "Instead of just pushing water out of the way, they're organizing it into more efficient patterns. It's like the yacht is teaching the water how to move." Joe studied the wake with growing amazement. Ellie was right. The water behind them showed signs of organized flow that suggested the yacht's passage was actually reducing turbulence rather than creating it. It was a level of efficiency that he'd never seen before, a harmony between vessel and medium that approached something like art. "This changes everything," Celeste breathed, her business mind immediately grasping the implications. "If we can document and replicate this effect, it's not just about energy generation anymore. It's about fundamentally more efficient marine transportation." The morning's discovery set the tone for the rest of the voyage. Each day brought new evidence that Joe's modifications had created something more significant than anyone had anticipated. The yacht wasn't just working with the ocean's energy, it was enhancing the ocean's natural efficiency, creating benefits that extended far beyond the vessel itself. But the technical successes were matched by personal discoveries that surprised Joe even more than the yacht's performance. Celeste proved to be an eager student of marine engineering, asking questions that revealed both her intelligence and her genuine curiosity about how things worked. She listened to Joe's explanations with the focused attention of someone who understood that true expertise came from experience rather than credentials. "I've spent years surrounded by people with impressive degrees and expensive educations," she told him one evening as they watched the sunset from the yacht's bow. "But you're the first person who's been able to explain complex systems in ways that actually make sense. You don't just know how things work, you understand why they work." Joe felt a flush of pride at her words, but also a growing awareness of the connection developing between them. Celeste was brilliant, successful, and beautiful, but more than that, she was becoming someone he genuinely cared about. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. She inhabited a world so different from his that any relationship seemed doomed from the start. "Miss Beaumont," he began, but she interrupted him with a gentle laugh. "After a week at sea together, I think you can call me Celeste," she said. "We're past the point of formal business relationships, don't you think?" "Celeste," Joe said, testing the name on his tongue, "there's something I need to tell you about the modifications, about what this all means." Before he could continue, his satellite phone rang with the harsh electronic tone that always seemed to shatter peaceful moments. Joe glanced at the caller ID and felt his stomach tighten. It was Mrs. Chen, calling from the marina with what could only be urgent news. "Joe, thank God I reached you." Mrs. Chen's voice was strained with worry. "You need to know what's happening here. There are people asking questions about you and your work on that yacht. Corporate types with expensive suits and legal documents." Joe felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. "What kind of questions?" "Questions about your background, your qualifications, your right to work on advanced marine systems. They're suggesting that you might have violated patent laws or professional licensing requirements." "Joe, they're talking about criminal charges." The news hit Joe like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on solving Celeste's problem that he hadn't considered the legal implications of his success. In a world where innovation was protected by patents and defended by armies of lawyers, his practical solution might be seen as theft rather than insight. "Who are they?" Joe asked, though he already suspected the answer. They won't say exactly, but their business cards have corporate logos I recognize. Companies that compete with Ms. Beaumont's firm. Joe, I think someone's trying to destroy your reputation, to undermine whatever you've accomplished out there. Joe looked at Celeste, who had caught enough of the conversation to understand that something was seriously wrong. Her expression had shifted from relaxed contentment to sharp concern, the business executive taking over from the woman who'd been enjoying a peaceful evening at sea. Mrs. Chen, I'll be back as soon as possible. Don't talk to anyone else about this until I get there. Be careful, Joe. These people have resources and legal teams that can make life very difficult for someone in your position. Whatever you've done out there, make sure you're protected. As Joe ended the call, he felt the weight of his situation settling over him like a storm cloud. His success in fixing Celeste's yacht had made him a target for people who viewed innovation as property to be owned rather than knowledge to be shared. The simple joy of solving a technical problem had been transformed into something complex and potentially dangerous. Joe, what's happening? Celeste's voice carried genuine concern. Who was that? Trouble, Joe said simply. The kind of trouble that comes when ordinary people accomplish extraordinary things in a world that doesn't believe ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things. As the yacht continued its smooth passage through the darkening ocean, Joe realized that their peaceful voyage was about to become something much more complicated. The real test of his modifications wasn't going to be their technical performance. It was going to be whether the people who'd created them could survive the legal and corporate warfare that innovation seemed to attract. The horizon ahead looked beautiful and treacherous in equal measure, promising both adventure and conflict in whatever lay beyond the setting sun. Joe pulled Ellie close and prepared himself for the battle he'd never wanted, but could no longer avoid. Sometimes, he reflected grimly, success was more dangerous than failure. The storm that had been building on the horizon for 2 days finally reached them on their 10th day at sea. Joe had been monitoring the weather reports with growing concern, but the yacht's improved systems had performed flawlessly through increasingly challenging conditions. Now, as waves began building to 12 feet and the wind howled across the deck with increasing fury, he prepared for the ultimate test of his modifications. All systems are performing within normal parameters, called Sarah Martinez, the yacht's chief engineer, from her position at the main console. Wave energy capture is actually increasing with the storm intensity, and the stabilization system is handling the rough seas better than our most optimistic projections. Joe nodded, watching the displays that showed his modifications working exactly as intended. The yacht rode the growing swells with fluid grace, her wave collectors channeling the storm's energy, while the stabilizers managed motion in ways that would have been impossible with the original systems. It was a vindication of everything he'd believed about working with natural forces rather than fighting them. "Dad, this is incredible," Ellie called from her position near the protected observation windows. "The yacht isn't fighting the storm, she's dancing with it." But Joe's satisfaction was tempered by a growing unease that had nothing to do with the weather. Throughout the morning, he'd noticed subtle anomalies in some of the yacht's secondary systems, minor fluctuations that shouldn't have been there. Small inconsistencies that suggested someone had been making unauthorized modifications. "Celeste," Joe called over the wind, "I need to check something in the engine compartment. These readings don't look right." He made his way below deck, his engineer's instinct screaming that something was wrong. The main propulsion and wave energy systems were working perfectly, but there were electronic signatures that didn't match his modifications or the yacht's original specifications. Someone had been tampering with the yacht systems, someone with sophisticated knowledge and expensive equipment. What Joe found in the secondary electrical panel made his blood run cold. Nestled among the legitimate control circuits was a device he didn't recognize, a small black box with no manufacturer's markings, but clearly designed to interface with the yacht's navigation and safety systems. It was connected to circuits that controlled emergency beacons, life raft deployment, and the yacht's ability to transmit distress signals. "Jesus," Joe breathed, realizing the implications. Someone had installed a device that could disable the yacht's safety systems remotely, leaving them helpless in exactly the kind of storm they were currently facing. He was examining the device more closely when footsteps on the stairs announced someone's arrival. Joe looked up to see a man he'd never met before, tall, well-dressed, and carrying himself with the kind of casual confidence that suggested both wealth and authority. "Mr. Carter, I presume?" the stranger said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Joe couldn't quite place. "Dr. Marcus Webb, Marine Systems Consultant. I believe we need to talk." "How did you get aboard?" Joe asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his toolkit. "We're 20 miles from shore in the middle of a storm. Helicopter, just before the weather got too rough for safe flying." Webb replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Though I suspect the timing of this storm is rather convenient for certain purposes." Joe felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. "You're the one who installed this device. You're sabotaging the yacht." "Sabotage is such an ugly word," Webb said, moving closer to Joe with predatory calm. "I prefer to think of it as quality control. You see, Mr. Carter, your little mechanical miracle has created some significant problems for people who have invested heavily in alternative approaches to sustainable marine propulsion. So you decided to kill us to protect your investments." Joe's voice carried the controlled fury of someone who just realized his daughter was in mortal danger. "Kill you? My dear man, nothing so dramatic. The device is simply designed to ensure that your modifications fail spectacularly under stress conditions. When this yacht breaks down in the middle of a storm and has to be rescued by conventional vessels, it will demonstrate the inherent unreliability of your approach." Webb's explanation was delivered with the casual arrogance of someone who viewed other people's lives as acceptable casualties in corporate warfare. "Of course, there's always some risk in these demonstrations. Storms can be unpredictable, safety systems can malfunction, accidents can happen. But that's the price of progress, don't you think?" Joe's mind raced through the implications. Webb's sabotage device could disable not just the yacht's propulsion systems, but also her emergency beacons and communication equipment. In a storm like this, that would be a death sentence for everyone aboard. The man was literally willing to commit murder to discredit Joe's engineering solution. "You're insane," Joe said, reaching for the sabotage device. "I'm removing this thing right now." "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Webb said, producing a small remote control from his jacket. "The device is armed with a dead man's switch. If it's tampered with or if I don't transmit the correct codes every hour, it will automatically activate all its functions. Your yacht will lose power, communications, and life safety systems simultaneously." Joe froze, his hand inches from the device. Webb had thought of everything, creating a situation where any attempt to remove the sabotage would trigger exactly the disaster he was threatening to cause. "What do you want?" Joe asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Simple. You publicly acknowledge that your modifications are experimental and unreliable. You recommend that Ms. Beaumont return to conventional propulsion systems designed by properly credentialed engineers. You disappear back to your little marina and never speak publicly about sustainable marine technology again. And if I refuse?" Webb's smile was genuinely chilling. "Then I'm afraid this storm is going to prove rather conclusively that amateur engineering is no match for the ocean's fury. Such a tragedia promising young girl and her father lost at sea because of mechanical failures that could have been prevented by proper professional oversight." The threat against Ellie crystallized Joe's fury into something cold and focused. He'd faced dangerous situations during his naval career, but never anything that involved his daughter's safety. Webb had made the mistake of threatening the one thing in the world that Joe would kill to protect. "You have 10 minutes to consider my offer," Webb continued, apparently oblivious to the change in Joe's demeanor. "After that, I'll be forced to conclude that you're unwilling to be reasonable about this situation." Joe nodded slowly, his mind already working through possibilities. Webb had the advantage of preparation and professional backing, but he'd made one crucial error. He'd underestimated what a father would do to protect his child. More than that, He'd underestimated what someone who truly understood these systems could accomplish with determination and desperation. 10 minutes, Joe agreed, but I want to check on my daughter first. Make sure she's safe before I make any decisions. Of course, Webb said magnanimously. Family is important, though I do hope you'll remember that your decision affects her future as much as your own. Joe climbed back to the main deck, where he found Celeste and Ellie monitoring the storm's progress from the protection of the enclosed bridge. The yacht was still performing magnificently, riding the increasingly violent swells with the kind of grace that proved his modifications worked exactly as intended. But none of that mattered if Webb's sabotage device activated. "Dad, the storm's getting worse," Ellie said as Joe approached, "but the yacht's handling it perfectly. Your modifications are working better than anyone hoped." "I know, sweetheart," Joe said, kneeling beside his daughter and pulling her close. "But we have a problem. A serious problem that has nothing to do with the storm or the yacht's systems." He explained the situation to Celeste in quick, quiet sentences, while Ellie listened with the kind of serious attention that reminded him how mature she'd become since her mother's death. Webb's sabotage, the threat to their safety, the impossible choice between surrendering his life's work and risking their lives. "That's corporate terrorism," Celeste said, her voice shaking with fury. "He's threatening to murder us to protect his client's market position. We have to contact the Coast Guard, the FBI." "With what?" Joe asked grimly. "He's controlling our communications, and even if we could get word out, help couldn't reach us in time. We're on our own out here." "So what do we do?" Ellie asked, her voice steady despite the fear Joe could see in her eyes. Joe looked at his daughter, brilliant, brave, and trusting him to find a solution to an impossible problem. Then he looked at Celeste, who'd given him the chance to prove his worth and was now paying the price for believing in him. Finally, he looked at the storm raging around them, at the ocean that had shaped his entire life and career. "We do what engineers do," he said finally. "We solve the problem." The solution that was forming in Joe's mind was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was the only chance they had. Webb thought he understood the yacht's systems well enough to sabotage them, but he didn't truly comprehend what Joe had created. The modifications weren't just about wave energy and stabilization. They were about fundamental harmony between human technology and natural forces. If Joe could turn that harmony into a weapon, he might be able to use Webb's own sabotage against him. It would require perfect timing, complete understanding of systems under extreme stress, and a willingness to risk everything on a single desperate gambit. But as he looked at Ellie's trusting face and felt Celeste's hand squeeze his shoulder in support, Joe realized he didn't have a choice. Webb had made the mistake of threatening the people Joe loved most in the world. Now he was going to learn what happened when you declared war on someone who had nothing left to lose. Joe's plan was insane, brilliant, and terrifyingly dangerous all at the same time. As he spread the yacht's original blueprints across the navigation table, his hands moved with the steady precision of someone who had learned to think clearly under pressure. The drawings were hand-sketched, technical specifications that predated Webb's sabotage, showing every system and circuit in their original configuration. "The key is understanding what Webb doesn't know," Joe explained to Celeste in low, urgent tones, while Ellie kept watch for their unwelcome passenger. "He's focused on the wave energy and stabilization systems because that's what everyone thinks my modifications are about. But the real innovation is in how all the systems communicate with each other." Joe pointed to sections of the blueprint that showed seemingly minor electrical connections between major components. "I didn't just reprogram individual systems, I created a unified nervous system that lets the yacht respond to conditions holistically. Webb's sabotage device can disrupt specific functions, but it can't break the underlying harmony." "I don't understand," Celeste said, her voice tight with stress. "How does that help us?" "Because Webb's device is designed to cause catastrophic failures in conventional systems. But our systems aren't conventional anymore, they're adaptive. If I can trigger the right response, the yacht's own intelligence might be able to isolate and neutralize the sabotage." Ellie returned from her watch position with disturbing news. He's been making phone calls on some kind of satellite device. I couldn't hear everything, but he mentioned timeline acceleration and acceptable losses. Dad, I think he's moved up his schedule. Joe felt his stomach tighten. Webb was getting impatient, which meant their window for action was closing rapidly. How much time do we have? He said something about 30 minutes until implementation, whatever that means. 30 minutes. Joe looked at the blueprints, at the storm raging outside, at his daughter's frightened but determined face. 30 minutes to outthink a professional saboteur, outwit corporate conspiracy, and save their lives using nothing but his understanding of systems that he'd modified without really comprehending their full potential. Okay, Joe said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had served him through countless crises. Here's what we're going to do. The plan required precise timing and absolute trust. Joe would need to access the yacht's main computer systems to implement a software patch that would isolate Webb's sabotage device while maintaining critical functions. Celeste would monitor the storm conditions and be ready to take manual control of the yacht if the automated systems failed. Ellie would watch Webb and signal if he made any suspicious moves. The dangerous part, Joe explained, is that we'll have to let him activate the sabotage device. If I try to prevent it, he'll know we're onto him and trigger everything manually. But if we let him think he's succeeding while I implement the patch, we might be able to turn his own weapon against him. That's incredibly risky, Celeste said. If your patch doesn't work exactly right, then we'll all die in this storm, Joe finished grimly. But if we do nothing, we'll definitely die. At least this way we have a chance. Joe began working with the focused intensity of someone whose family's life depended on perfect execution. The yacht's computer systems were sophisticated but not impenetrable. He designed his modifications to work within existing frameworks, which meant he understood their vulnerabilities as well as their strengths. The software patch he was creating was essentially a bypass system that would reroute critical functions around Webb's sabotage device. If it worked, the yacht would appear to suffer the catastrophic failures Webb expected while actually maintaining enough functionality to survive the storm. If it failed, they would face the real catastrophic failures that Webb intended. Dad, Ellie whispered urgently, he's coming back up. Joe saved his work and closed the laptop just as Webb emerged from below deck, his expression carrying the satisfied confidence of someone who believed he held all the cards. The storm had intensified during the past hour, with waves now reaching 15 feet and wind gusts that made standing on deck dangerous, even with safety lines. Well, Mr. Carter, have you reached a decision? Webb asked, his voice pitched to carry over the wind. I'm afraid time is running rather short. I need to know something first. Joe said, meeting Webb's gaze with steady determination. Who's paying you to do this? Which company considers my modifications enough of a threat to justify murder? Webb's smile was genuinely amused. Oh, my dear man, you still don't understand the scope of what you've stumbled into. This isn't about one company or one market, it's about maintaining the proper order of innovation. You represent a very dangerous precedent. What precedent? The precedent that ordinary people with practical experience might be more valuable than credentialed experts with theoretical knowledge. If word gets out that a dock worker can solve problems that stump teams of PhD engineers, it undermines the entire structure of modern technological development. Webb gestured toward the yacht's sophisticated systems, his tone taking on the quality of a lecture. The marine technology industry represents billions of dollars in research, investment, patent portfolios, and consulting contracts. That investment is predicated on the assumption that innovation comes from properly funded, professionally managed development programs. People like you threaten that assumption. Joe felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm as he realized the full scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just corporate sabotage, it was an assault on the very idea that innovation could come from unexpected sources. Webb represented forces that viewed Joe's success as an existential threat to their control over technological progress. So you're willing to kill us to protect an industry's business model? Celeste asked, her voice carrying both fury and disbelief. "I'm willing to prevent a dangerous precedent from destabilizing carefully constructed market relationships," Webb corrected. "Mr. Carter's modifications work, I'll grant you that. But allowing them to succeed would send entirely the wrong message about where innovation should come from." "And what message is that?" Ellie asked, her young voice cutting through the adult conversation with characteristic directness. Webb looked at her with the kind of indulgent condescension that adults often showed precocious children. "That formal education and professional credentials aren't necessary for technological innovation. That anyone can solve complex problems if they just think about them hard enough. It's a charming notion, but terribly naive." "Why is it naive?" Ellie pressed, her scientific curiosity overriding her fear. "If someone solves a problem, doesn't that prove they understood it well enough to find the solution? Understanding and credentials are different things, child. The world needs structure, hierarchy, and proper channels for innovation. Otherwise, we'd have every amateur tinkerer claiming to revolutionize established industries." Joe listened to this exchange with growing understanding of what they were really fighting. Webb didn't just want to destroy Joe's modification. She wanted to destroy the very idea that ordinary people could contribute to extraordinary solutions. It was a battle between two completely different philosophies of how human knowledge and capability should be organized. "Time's up, Mr. Carter," Webb announced, glancing at an expensive watch. "I need your decision now." Joe looked at Celeste, then at Ellie, then at the storm raging around them. His software patch was as ready as he could make it in the available time, but he wouldn't know if it worked until Webb activated his sabotage device. Everything depended on perfect timing and a level of technical understanding that went beyond what any manual or training program could provide. "I've made my decision," Joe said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had chosen his ground and was prepared to defend it. "I won't renounce my work, I won't disappear quietly, and I won't let you threaten my daughter." Webb's expression shifted from confident superiority to cold calculation. "I was hoping you'd be more reasonable, but I suppose some people have to learn lessons the hard way." He reached into his jacket and produced the remote control device, its small screen glowing ominously in the storm's darkness. "This will disable your yacht's propulsion, navigation, and emergency systems simultaneously. In seas like these, you'll have perhaps 20 minutes before the hull breaks apart." "Unless?" Joe asked, though he already knew there was no unless. Webb had moved beyond negotiation to implementation. "Unless nothing. You've made your choice, and now you'll live with the consequences, or more accurately, you'll die with them." Webb's finger moved toward the activation button, and Joe felt time slow to a crystalline clarity that he remembered from his most dangerous moments in naval service. Everything depended on the next few seconds. She's software patch, his understanding of the yacht's systems, and his ability to turn Webb's own sabotage into a weapon against its creator. "Ellie, Celeste," Joe said quietly, "hold on to something solid and trust me." Webb pressed the button, and the yacht's world changed instantly. Lights flickered throughout the vessel as the sabotage device activated, sending disruptive signals through every major system. The wave energy collectors stuttered and went offline. The stabilization system began fighting itself in chaotic oscillations, and the navigation displays filled with error messages and system failures. But Joe's patch was already working, silently rerouting critical functions around the sabotage while allowing non-essential systems to fail spectacularly. To Webb, it would appear that his device was working exactly as intended. The yacht was dying, a slow, technological death in the middle of a storm that would ensure no survivors. "Magnificent," Webb said, watching the cascade of system failures with professional satisfaction. "Your little engineering miracle is coming apart like tissue paper in a hurricane. Perhaps next time you'll remember that some problems are too complex for amateur solutions." What Webb didn't notice, because he was focused on the visible failures, was that the yacht's essential functions were still operating through backup pathways that his sabotage couldn't detect. The propulsion system appeared to be offline, but Joe had rerouted power through the wave energy collector's emergency circuits. The navigation system showed total failure, but critical sensors were still feeding data through maintenance channels that Webb's device ignored. Most importantly, the yacht's communication systems appeared completely dead, while actually maintaining an encrypted emergency channel that Joe had activated when he implemented his patch. Help was already on the way, though it would take time to reach them through the storm. "You killed us," Celeste said, her voice carrying exactly the right mixture of despair and accusation. "You actually killed us to protect your client's profits." "I protected the proper order of technological development," Webb corrected, apparently oblivious to the moral horror of his actions. "Unfortunate casualties are sometimes necessary to prevent larger disruptions." Joe watched the man who had just tried to murder his family and felt a cold satisfaction as his plan moved into its final phase. Webb thought he had won, but he was about to learn that underestimating practical intelligence was a mistake that carried its own consequences. The yacht shuddered as another massive wave struck her hull, but she rode through it with the resilience that Joe's modifications had built into her systems. To Webb, it looked like the beginning of structural failure. To Joe, it was proof that his engineering was strong enough to survive both the storm and the sabotage. "Hold on," Joe said quietly to Celeste and Ellie. "This is about to get interesting." Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, but inside the yacht, a different kind of storm was about to break. Webb had made the mistake of bringing corporate warfare to a fight with a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. The reckoning was about to begin. The yacht's apparent death throes reached their crescendo 20 minutes after Webb activated his sabotage device. Lights flickered wildly throughout the vessel, alarm klaxons wailed their electronic warnings, and the main display screens showed a cascade of system failures that painted a picture of imminent catastrophic breakdown. To anyone watching, it appeared that the sophisticated yacht was succumbing to the storm's fury exactly as Webb had intended. "The hull integrity is compromised," Webb announced with professional satisfaction as he monitored the yacht's apparent disintegration through his own diagnostic equipment. "You have perhaps 10 minutes before the wave action tears this vessel apart completely." But Joe was watching different indicators' subtle readings that his modifications had built into the yacht's hidden pathways. While the primary system showed total failure, the backup circuits were functioning perfectly, maintaining just enough power and control to keep them alive while appearing completely dead to Webb's sabotage device. Ellie caught Joe's eye and nodded almost imperceptibly. She'd been watching Webb's equipment and had noticed what he'd missed. Several of his monitoring systems were showing data that didn't match what was actually happening. Joe's patch was feeding false information to Webb's diagnostics, creating a convincing illusion of system failure, while the yacht's essential functions continued, operating through channels that the sabotage couldn't detect. "Dad," Ellie said, her voice carrying exactly the right note of frightened confusion, "why aren't the emergency systems working? Shouldn't the life rafts be deploying automatically?" "Because your father's amateur engineering has doomed us all," Webb replied before Joe could answer. "Professional marine systems include multiple redundancies and fail-safes. Amateur modifications eliminate those protections in favor of elegance and efficiency." Joe felt a surge of anger at Webb's casual dismissal of his work, but he forced himself to maintain the appearance of defeat while positioning himself for what came next. Webb's confidence was his weakness. He was so certain of his sabotage's effectiveness that he wasn't monitoring the yacht's actual condition, only the false readings that Joe's patch was feeding to his equipment. "The storm's getting worse," Celeste said, her voice shaking with what sounded like despair, but was actually carefully controlled excitement. "We're going to die out here because of your corporate games." "Unfortunate but necessary," Webb said with the callous indifference of someone who viewed other people's lives as acceptable casualties. "The marine technology industry represents billions in investment and thousands of jobs. Protecting that industry from destabilizing influences is worth a few individual sacrifices." What Webb didn't notice, because he was focused on his equipment and his own sense of professional triumph, was that the yacht's motion through the water had changed subtly over the past several minutes. Instead of the chaotic wallowing that should have accompanied total system failure, she was beginning to move with purpose, again not the smooth grace of her original performance, but the determined progress of a vessel under deliberate control. Joe's backup systems were coming online, exactly as he'd designed them to, routing around Webb's sabotage through pathways that appeared to be maintenance circuits, but were actually sophisticated control networks. The wave energy collectors looked dead, but were secretly feeding power to essential systems. The stabilizers appeared offline, but were actually maintaining just enough control to keep the yacht stable in the heavy seas. "Mr. Webb," Joe said quietly, "there's something you should know about amateur engineering." "Oh?" Webb didn't look up from his monitoring equipment, apparently fascinated by the data showing the yacht's systematic destruction. "Please, enlighten me about the superiority of practical experience over professional training. Amateur engineers don't just solve the problems they're given," Joe said, moving closer to Webb with careful casualness. "They solve the problems they think they might encounter in the future." Something in Joe's tone finally penetrated Webb's professional satisfaction. He looked up from his equipment to find Joe standing much closer than he'd been moments before, his expression carrying a confidence that seemed completely at odds with their apparently desperate situation. "What do you mean?" Webb asked, his hand moving instinctively toward the remote control that he believed gave him complete power over their situation. "I mean that when I modified this yacht's systems, I didn't just make them work better under normal conditions," Joe explained, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who truly understood what he was talking about. "I made them resilient against exactly the kind of sabotage you've just attempted." Webb's eyes widened as the implications sank in. "That's impossible. My device disrupted every major system on this vessel. I monitored the failures personally." "You monitored the failures I wanted you to see," Joe corrected. "While your sabotage was destroying the yacht's primary systems, my backup networks were taking over essential functions through pathways that your device couldn't detect." To demonstrate his point, Joe pulled out a small handheld controller that Webb hadn't seen before. As Joe's fingers moved across its surface, the yacht's motion changed. Noticeably, the chaotic wallowing stopped, replaced by the purposeful movement of a vessel under complete control. "You see, Mr. Webb, the difference between amateur and professional engineering isn't credentials or training programs. It's the difference between solving problems and preventing them." Webb's face went pale as he realized that his carefully planned sabotage had not only failed, but had been anticipated and countered by the very person he'd tried to eliminate. "This is impossible. No one could have predicted—" "Actually, it was fairly obvious," Ellie interrupted, her young voice cutting through Webb's protests with scientific precision. "Once we realized that someone might try to sabotage our work, Dad just designed backup systems that looked like maintenance circuits, but were actually complete control networks. The beauty of it," Joe added, "is that your sabotage device worked exactly as designed. It destroyed every system it was supposed to destroy. It just didn't destroy the systems you didn't know existed." Webb's hand moved toward his jacket, where Joe assumed he kept additional equipment or possibly a weapon. But Joe was ready for that possibility. His years of naval service had taught him to anticipate violence when desperate people realized their plans had failed. "I wouldn't," Joe said quietly, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who had faced dangerous men before. "Celeste, would you mind calling the Coast Guard and letting them know we have the situation under control?" Celeste produced a satellite communicator that appeared to be working perfectly, despite the apparent communication failures that Webb's sabotage was supposed to have caused. "Coast Guard, this is Yacht Harmony requesting immediate assistance with a criminal matter. We have an individual aboard who has attempted sabotage and made threats against passengers. We need law enforcement intercept as soon as weather permits." The response came through clearly, confirming that Coast Guard vessels were already en route and would reach them within the hour. Webb's face registered shock as he realized that not only had his sabotage failed, but his victims had been in communication with authorities throughout his attempted crime. "You've been talking to them this whole time?" Webb asked, his professional composure finally cracking under the weight of his situation. "Professional maritime engineers always maintain emergency communications," Joe said with gentle irony. "It's one of those basic safety principles they teach in amateur engineering school." As the full scope of his failure became clear, Webb's expression shifted from shocked disbelief to something approaching panic. He'd committed serious federal crimes in the belief that there would be no witnesses to testify against him. Now he faced not just failure but prosecution for attempted murder on the high seas. "This isn't over," Webb said, his voice carrying the desperate threat of someone who'd lost everything. "You have no idea what forces you're opposing. This yacht, your modifications, your entire approach it threatens billions of dollars in established industry investment." "Then maybe," Ellie said with the clear logic that only children could bring to complex situations, "those industries should learn to build better boats instead of trying to sabotage the people who already figured out how to do it." The yacht rode through another massive swell with the effortless grace that proved Joe's modifications were working exactly as intended, storm and sabotage notwithstanding. Outside, the tempest continued to rage with undiminished fury, but inside the yacht's protected spaces, a different kind of storm had reached its resolution. Webb's corporate conspiracy had failed, not because of superior force or legal maneuvering, but because practical wisdom had proven more resilient than institutional arrogance. Joe's amateur engineering had survived both natural disaster and human malice, demonstrating that true innovation came, not from credentials or funding, but from understanding how things actually worked in the real world. The Coast Guard was coming, the yacht was safe, and Webb's attempt to destroy Joe's work had instead provided the most dramatic possible proof of its effectiveness. As Joe watched the man who'd tried to kill his family struggle with the collapse of his carefully laid plans, he felt not triumph, but a quiet satisfaction that justice was finally being served. The storm was beginning to break, and dawn couldn't be far away. The Coast Guard cutter appeared on the horizon, just as the storm began to exhaust itself, emerging from the grey morning like a symbol of order restored to chaos. Joe watched through the yacht's observation windows as the military vessel approached with purposeful efficiency, its crew clearly experienced in handling situations that required both maritime expertise and law enforcement authority. "Yacht Harmony, this is Coast Guard cutter Steadfast." The radio crackled with official authority. "We're prepared to take custody of your passenger and provide escort back to port. Please prepare for boarding operations." Webb stood at the yacht's rail with the defeated posture of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed in the span of a few hours. His expensive equipment lay secured but useless, his corporate authority reduced to nothing by the simple fact that his sabotage had failed so completely. Joe almost felt sorry for him, but not quite. "Mr. Webb," Joe said as they waited for the Coast Guard boarding party, "there's something I want you to understand before they take you away." Webb turned toward him with eyes that held the hollow look of someone who'd bet everything on a single plan and lost. "What's that, Mr. Carter?" "You were right about one thing. My modifications do represent a threat to established industry practices, but not because they're amateur or unprofessional, because they work better than what the professionals have been doing." Joe gestured toward the yacht's systems, which were now operating openly rather than through hidden backup networks. "The difference isn't credentials or funding or corporate backing. It's the difference between trying to control natural forces and learning to work with them." "Your approach threatens billions in investment," Webb began, but Joe interrupted him with a shake of his head. "My approach threatens billions in wasted investment. There's a difference. The companies you represent have been throwing money at problems instead of understanding them. When someone comes along who actually understands the problems, it makes all that wasted money look foolish." The Coast Guard boarding party arrived with the crisp efficiency of professionals who'd handled hundreds of similar situations. 2 officers in tactical gear secured Webb, while a third began documenting the evidence of sabotage and attempted murder. Joe was struck by how quickly the complex corporate conspiracy was reduced to simple criminal charges that would be handled by straightforward legal processes. Dr. Webb, you're under arrest for attempted sabotage of a vessel in navigable waters, conspiracy to commit murder, and violation of federal maritime safety regulations, the lead officer announced as he placed Webb in restraints. You have the right to remain silent. As the familiar words of the Miranda warning echoed across the yacht's deck, Joe felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the immediate danger was over, sadness that it had come to this at all. Webb was a brilliant man whose talents could have contributed to real innovation if he hadn't been corrupted by the institutional arrogance that valued control over competence. Mr. Carter, the Coast Guard officer approached Joe after securing Webb. We'll need detailed statements from all of you, but that can wait until we're back in port. Are there any immediate medical concerns or safety issues we should address? We're all fine, Joe replied, glancing at Ellie and Celeste to confirm their condition. The yacht's systems are operating normally, and we're ready to head home whenever you are. The return journey to Newport Bay took 6 hours, with the Coast Guard cutter providing escort, while Joe piloted the yacht through gradually calming seas. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind the kind of crystalline air and perfect visibility that made the ocean look like a vast blue mirror, reflecting infinite possibilities. "Dad," Ellie said as they watched the familiar coastline grow larger on the horizon, "what happens now? With the yacht, I mean, and your modifications?" It was a good question, one that Joe had been pondering since Webb's arrest. The sabotage attempt had provided dramatic proof that his modifications worked, but it had also revealed the extent of opposition from established industry forces. Success brought its own complications. "I don't know, sweetheart," Joe admitted, "but I think we've proven something important out here." "What's that?" Celeste asked, joining their conversation from her position at the navigation station. "That good ideas don't require permission from institutions or validation from credentials. They just require understanding and the courage to implement that understanding." Celeste was quiet for a long moment, watching the water flow past the yacht's hull with the efficient grace that Joe's modifications had made possible. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a determination that reminded Joe of the woman who'd thrown down a public challenge to 30 engineers. "Joe, I want to offer you something. Not just a consulting arrangement or a position with my company, but a genuine partnership. Your modifications have proven that there's a better way to approach marine engineering. I want to build a company around that approach." Joe felt his heart skip as the implications of her offer sank in. A partnership meant equity, respect, and the chance to develop his ideas without the constant worry about corporate interference or financial survival. It meant security for Ellie and the opportunity to work on projects that mattered. "What kind of partnership?" he asked carefully. "Equal partners," Celeste said without hesitation. "Your engineering expertise, my business connections and capital. We'll develop sustainable marine technologies that work with natural forces instead of fighting them. And we'll do it in a way that proves ordinary people with extraordinary insights can change entire industries. But I don't have credentials or formal training in advanced marine engineering." "You have something better," Celeste interrupted. "You have understanding. Webb was right that your approach threatens established industry practices. I want to be part of that threat." Joe looked at his daughter, whose eyes were shining with excitement at the possibilities Celeste's offer represented. Then he looked at the yacht around them, still performing flawlessly despite having survived both natural disaster and human malice. Finally, he looked at Celeste, seeing not just a successful businesswoman, but a partner who shared his vision of what engineering could accomplish when it was driven by understanding rather than ego. "Partners," he said, extending his hand to seal the agreement. As Newport Bay appeared ahead of them, its familiar harbor welcoming them home, Joe realized that their voyage had become something much more significant than a simple test of his modifications. It had become proof that innovation could triumph over institutional resistance, that practical wisdom could overcome corporate conspiracy, and that sometimes the most profound changes came from the most unexpected sources. The yacht's systems hummed with quiet efficiency as they approached the marina, a testament to the power of working with natural forces rather than against them. Behind them, the ocean stretched to the horizon, full of possibilities that hadn't existed a few weeks ago. Ahead of them lay a future that neither Joe nor Celeste could have imagined when she'd first thrown down her challenge to fix her boat. It was a future built on partnership, understanding, and the revolutionary idea that good engineering was about harmony rather than domination. As they guided the yacht into her berth, Joe felt Sarah's presence as strongly as if she were standing beside him. She would have loved this moment, the vindication of her theories, the proof that cooperation could triumph over conflict, and the promise that their daughter would grow up in a world where innovation was limited only by imagination rather than institutional boundaries. The voyage was over, but the real journey was just beginning. 6 months later, Joe stood in the engineering workshop that had once seemed impossible, a gleaming facility overlooking Newport Bay, where Carter Beaumont Marine Technologies was revolutionizing sustainable ocean transportation. The space hummed with the quiet efficiency of serious work, its drafting tables and computer stations occupied by a carefully chosen team of engineers who shared Joe's philosophy of working with natural forces rather than fighting them. "Dad, the new prototype is ready for testing," Ellie announced as she entered the workshop, her notebook filled with the detailed observations that had become her specialty. At 11, she was already recognized as the company's youngest consultant, her insights into harmonic resonance earning respect from engineers with decades of experience. Joe looked up from the technical drawings he'd been reviewing plans for a new class of cargo vessels that would use his wave energy principles to reduce fuel consumption by 60% while actually improving performance. Rough seas. The shipping industry's initial skepticism had given way to serious interest as word spread about the yacht's remarkable capabilities. "How are the efficiency numbers looking?" Joe asked, following Ellie toward the testing basin where a scale model of their latest design moved through simulated ocean conditions. "Better than we projected," Ellie replied with the calm professionalism she'd developed over months of working alongside world-class engineers. "The new hull configuration is generating 20% more energy than the original yacht design while maintaining superior stability." Joe watched the model perform its graceful dance with artificial waves, each movement confirming that his principles scaled successfully from experimental modifications to commercial applications. The technology that had started as a desperate attempt to solve one woman's problem was becoming the foundation for an entirely new approach to marine transportation. "Joe, you need to see this." Celeste's voice carried across the workshop from her office overlooking the harbor. "The Department of Energy just approved our grant application for the commercial shipping demonstration project." Joe made his way to Celeste's office, where she stood behind a desk covered with contracts, patent applications, and correspondence from shipping companies around the world. The transformation from frustrated yacht owner to successful entrepreneur had been remarkable to witness. Celeste had thrown herself into building their company with the same determined energy she'd once applied to yacht racing. $12 million, Celeste said, holding up the official notification. "Plus matching funds from 3 major shipping lines that want to test our technology on actual cargo routes. Joe, we're about to prove that your modifications can work on vessels carrying thousands of tons of freight across oceans." The news was both thrilling and daunting. Success with the yacht had been personally satisfying, but relatively small in scope. Success with commercial shipping would affect global trade patterns, environmental impact, and the lives of millions of people whose livelihoods depended on ocean transportation. "Any word from Webb's trial?" Joe asked, settling into the chair across from Celeste's desk. "Convicted on all counts," Celeste replied with satisfaction. 20 years for attempted murder, plus additional sentences for sabotage and conspiracy charges. The investigation also exposed the network of companies that hired him. "Apparently our little yacht repair threatened a lot more corporate interests than we realized." Joe nodded, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. Webb's conviction had sent a clear message that corporate violence against innovation wouldn't be tolerated, but it hadn't eliminated the institutional resistance to new approaches. Success in business required not just good ideas, but the ability to navigate the complex web of established interests that viewed change as threat rather than opportunity. The irony, Celeste continued, is that Webb's sabotage attempt became the best possible advertisement for our technology. Video footage of the yacht surviving a major storm despite deliberate sabotage convinced more potential clients than any amount of technical documentation could have. Through the office windows, Joe could see the original yacht moored at the company's private dock, now serving as both test platform and symbol of what was possible when innovation met determination. The vessel looked the same as the day he'd first examined her broken systems, but her influence had spread far beyond her original purpose. "There's something else," Celeste said, her tone shifting to something more personal. "The partnership agreement expires next month, and I wanted to discuss renewal terms." Joe felt a familiar flutter of uncertainty. Their business partnership had evolved into something deeper over the months of working together, but they'd both been careful to maintain professional boundaries while building the company. The question of what happened next personally as well as professionally had been an unspoken presence in their relationship. "What kind of renewal terms?" Joe asked carefully. Celeste smiled, reaching into her desk drawer to produce a document that looked different from their usual business contracts. "Well, I was thinking we might consider a more permanent arrangement. Something that involves shared assets, joint decision-making, and a commitment to long-term collaboration." Joe's heart skipped as he realized what she was suggesting. "Celeste." "Joe Carter," she interrupted, standing and moving around the desk to face him directly. "You've taught me that the most important partnerships are built on mutual respect, shared values, and the willingness to take risks together. I can't imagine building this company or this life with anyone else." The proposal was characteristically direct, practical, and emotionally honest. Joe looked at this remarkable woman who'd challenged him to solve an impossible problem, and then stood beside him as they built something neither of them could have achieved alone. She represented partnership in its truest sense, no just business collaboration, but the joining of complementary strengths to create something greater than the sum of its parts. "Partners," Joe said, taking her hands in his, in every sense of the word. Their kiss was interrupted by Ellie's delighted cheer from the doorway, where she stood with a tablet displaying test results and a smile that could have powered their wave energy collectors. "Does this mean we're all going to be family?" she asked with the directness that had helped solve their original engineering problem. "I think it does," Celeste said, kneeling to embrace Ellie with the natural affection that had developed over months of shared adventures and discoveries. "How do you feel about having a stepmother who's obsessed with sustainable marine technology?" "I think Mum would approve," Ellie said seriously. "She always said that the best partnerships were between people who made each other better than they could be alone." As afternoon faded into evening, the three of them stood on the yacht's deck, watching the sunset paint Newport Bay in shades of gold and crimson. Around them, the harbor bustled with the familiar rhythm of boats and people pursuing their various dreams and necessities. But from their vantage point, the view looked different than it had 6 months ago, full of possibilities that hadn't existed before Joe accepted Celeste's impossible challenge. "What's next?" Ellie asked, her question directed at both her father and her soon-to-be stepmother. "College for you," Joe said, ruffling his daughter's hair with paternal pride. "The best marine engineering program we can find, with enough financial backing to let you focus on learning instead of worrying about costs." "A wedding," Celeste added with a smile that made Joe's heart race. "Something simple but meaningful, maybe right here on the yacht where we figured out that we worked well together." "And then?" Ellie pressed, her scientific curiosity demanding complete data. Joe looked at the harbor spread before them, at the boats that represented both tradition and innovation, at the ocean that had shaped his entire life and career. "Then we change the world," he said simply, "one boat at a time, one problem at a time, one impossible challenge at a time." The yacht rocked gently in her berth, her systems humming with the quiet efficiency that had proven that extraordinary solutions could come from the most ordinary sources. In the workshop behind them, engineers were developing technologies that would make ocean transportation cleaner, more efficient, and more harmonious with the natural forces that had shaped the planet for millions of years. But more than technological success, Joe had found something he'd thought lost forever, a family united by love, curiosity, and the shared belief that understanding was more powerful than credentials, that cooperation was more effective than competition, and that sometimes the most profound innovations emerged from the simplest insights. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Joe Carter, former dock worker, naval engineer, and now partner in one of the most promising marine technology companies in the world, realized that Sarah had been right about more than just engineering principles. The ocean really did teach those who listened to it, and the most important lesson it offered was that everything was connected, everything was possible, and every challenge was an opportunity for those brave enough to see solutions where others saw only problems. The waves lapped gently against the yacht's hull, carrying whispers of adventures yet to come and innovations yet to be discovered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new chances to prove that when practical wisdom met determined effort, there was no limit to what ordinary people could accomplish. But tonight, surrounded by family and floating on dreams made manifest, Joe Carter was exactly where he belonged, home, in a harbor full of possibilities, ready for whatever the tide might bring.